This is, anyway, even before anything in the last few days, the most fascinating and challenging and interesting decade for professionals serving the rural economy. We have changes in policy in each part of the United Kingdom, quite radical changes. We have discussions of productivity, we have discussions of the environment, we have the challenges of climate change, we have all the new technologies, we have all the other issues that are coming along, and everybody with a farm, with an estate, with an interest in rural land or rural business is in increasing need of good, personal and relevant advice to help them. And that's what we do. As the national specialist professional body for that work, and we've been around over 100 years, so slightly longer just than Davison Robertson, even slightly longer than Mark's been at Harper. We provide that service, and in this we brief valuers, we qualify valuers, and then we represent them. And that's the background for which I'm going to be looking at the current political challenges. Because we talk with governments across the UK, but here particularly, of course, we're looking into Whitehall and Westminster. We provide dispassionate, practical, professional, objective assessments of what's in play. We have to understand what is tabled, and then we have to be able to talk with government about, well, if those are what you're doing, then there are these consequences. Equally, just turning the other way around, members and us briefing members have to be able to talk to an individual farmer, an individual owner, and say, this is how it might play through for you, these are the things, these are the opportunities, and these are the problems. And so it's that role that nationally we provide so that the people from Shropshire here in the front, Charlotte and Sarah, Martin, you in the future, can provide those services directly to help people make the best they can of the situation they're in as they face all the varied challenges that we now have. So I was told you wanted to talk about budget, and it's really been quite a week. We've had it started with the budget, and then it finishes with the American election. That's all a week that makes the overnight collapse of the German government seem quite tame. But it's massive, and this simply adds to everything that we face. And obviously we wait to see after January what Trump will do. He has an almost a level of control of the American political system that's probably been unparalleled for over 80 years. I suspect that by now he may now have Republican control of the House of Representatives. He has certainly now won control of the Senate. He has won the presidency, and the Supreme Court has a number of his nominees on it. It's fascinating, and he has no need to get re-elected after this. He's had his crack. We wait to see what happens, whether it's tariffs, whether it's lower corporation tax rates. And I was in Dublin 2 days ago, and that's a real challenge to the Irish economy if he cuts corporation tax rates for countries already being quite challenged by the level of outside investment there. All the other things that might or might not happen, what plays through in Ukraine, and of course the issue is probably to see what he does more than what he says. But again, we wait to see. So that is sitting there as an added uncertainty to all that we have. So we come back and look, I think, perhaps more broadly at the new government. It was elected essentially to get rid of the previous one. They may perhaps think they have a more positive mandate, but I think that was the fundamental of it. They were elected on a manifesto that was in many ways very thin. You can look at the 87 words on agriculture in the 260 columns of the Labour manifesto, and not many of them boil down to words with meaning. The really serious core of the manifesto, which had content, was around planning, energy, infrastructure, housing. And that gets you to a purpose for this government. But on all other matters, it was really quite light. And that's a challenge when you come to look at what actually they might hope to do. They've laid out 5 missions, of which 2 are particularly relevant to the kind of material we might cover today. And the first is growth. They've used the words about the sheer importance of recovering economic growth in a country which, and in many ways like most of Western Europe, but in a country which has had a stagnant economy since the financial crisis. Recovering economic growth so that people have more income, there is more tax, there is more ability to fund public services from health to defence, but there is more ability for people to pay for the lifestyles to which many people feel they're entitled. And so growth, economic growth, is absolutely critical. For those who think that there is a degrowth model for the future, we're living through it. That's not very attractive. The other one, and a very clear mission in this, and one on which they have taken steps, is around answering climate change. And that is one essentially and fundamentally about making the shift to remove fossil fuels from electricity generation in this country. And that we have seen already some things delivered on that, and a minister with past cabinet experience who is using the levers of government to make significant progress on that. So they came in July. July, they spent very energetically on the planning, housing, energy, infrastructure process, setting in hand virtually all the steps that don't need new legislation. So we have the 1.5 million housing target by 29. Very challenging, but it sets a direction. We've been building, if we're lucky, 1 million houses a parliament. We may be 5 million houses light for our population if we really look at it hard, given the scale of housing need. It's a step in the direction, whether we're capable, whether we have the builders, whether we have the materials, whether we have the money, whether we have the time and everything else, but they are doing, they set in hand a lot of things to make progress towards that goal. But the clock on that is ticking. And actually, of course, what's been happening for parts of this year is the clock has been ticking backwards. Because if it's 1.5 million houses a year, well, on average, that's 300,000 houses. So 1.5 million by 2029, that's on average 300,000 houses a year. And actually, since we've been building, if we're good, 200,000, it really means a lot more as we get to the tail end of the Parliament. It means accelerating up the scale of construction if we can. It means unblocking the planning system, and Keir Starmer's talked about bulldozing the planning system to get things out of the way, you know, the builders not blockers kind of argument and so on. Actually this year, first half of this year, we built 64,000 houses. It's pretty much halved, and not only in England, also in Scotland. You're watching that fall back as a result of uncertainty, interest rates, issues in the construction market and so on. So we have a challenge to move forward on that target. But they have told councils, you will have to build. Here are your targets. They are mandatory targets. If you can't do them, well, work out with your neighbour how you're going to do them. Your job as a councillor is now not if that housing is going to happen, it's how you're going to deliver it. Very strong words. You have a more professional and a moral duty, wrote Angela Rayner at the end of July, to deliver those houses. You have got, after 70 years, you've got the breaking of the taboo of the Greenbelt. Actually, you can now have new settlements, urban extensions in the Greenbelt, provided they don't compromise the purpose of the Greenbelt. You've now also got the New Towns Working Group to report back by July on where sites for new urban expansions and new settlements of more than 10,000 houses can be. This comes on stream really in the next Parliament, but the planning and everything for all of that, with prospective added compulsory purchase powers, with development to fund all its infrastructure, all that is being put in place at the moment. What we don't yet have, and we may not have till next year, because this is now where we begin to see government demands meet realities of the real world as to how that comes through. So a lot done on that. We've seen it again, I mentioned, on energy. 4 major solar farm projects covering 9,500 acres from Suffolk through till the Humber, approved by the Secretary of State, by Ed Miliband. Other smaller ones, Greenbelt and outside, approved, and a lot of calling in of planning applications. The £750 million film studio outside Marlow in the Chilterns AONB, refused locally, being called in for decision nationally, again, to try and unlock some of this. And this is where the two link in, all these link into the growth agenda as well as the climate agenda. But a long way to go. To deliver fully renewable electricity by 2030, which is the target, is probably even more challenging than the housing target. But it sets a very, very strong sense of direction, rewriting how you get grid connections. And that plays, to bring it back to a professional point, That plays very much to where value lies. We have thought about how does value lie against where you are in your relationship to the grid. Surely there must be some value in being near a grid connection, because will a battery operator want to compete with a wind turbine, with a solar farm for access to your land? And they all bid it up, and this is all good news. We're now seeing that really come through. In the Midlands, part of a solar farm has now had to be replaced by a substation because that's the higher value use of it to get the grid connections. You're watching a driver in those big solar applications being, are you near a grid connection? You're now watching Amazon and Microsoft and so on want the old coal-fired power station sites to house the new data centers because they're on the grid. They also have the water that used to cool the power station that now cools the data center. So they're all coming in for these things. But somewhere, of course, there's somebody on the wrong end of this, the man next door to the grid, across whose land all the wretched cables come, and he suffers the burden of that. But each of those people need advice as we come through. So all that was pretty energetic in July. And then slowly, as we get into the early autumn, for a government that we think was using its time to prepare for a really hard-pounding autumn to get things done, to use the momentum of a great new majority, it became clear that not much else was coming out of government. It was all actually very quiet. Now, nature abhors a vacuum. The budget we'd expected to be in mid-September, but we learned, well, because of the timetables, by the time we got past the 19th of July, it couldn't be until mid-October, and in the end it was held on October 30th. And nature abhorred that vacuum. So we had endless speculation, febrile speculation about, well, what tax change is it going to be? How bad is it going to be? You'd be amazed how people can work themselves up about how much they're about to be a victim of something like this. Lots and lots and lots of activity. People reorganizing themselves ahead of the great threat because the doom loop language that we were getting. And there are reasons behind that, but it was ill-judged to maintain confidence in the economy or people to keep economic activity going. We're taking Martin coming from Edinburgh. There's a firm of Edinburgh solicitors called Turk & Connell. I'm told the final client left their offices at 3 a.m. on the morning of the budget day. All restructuring businesses. This September's capital gains tax receipts. So these are only the very earliest ones from all the activity this autumn. Mostly they'll come through when we get to January or following January. So these are where people have disposed of companies, disposed of properties, disposed of holiday lets or whatever in order to get themselves out under a known capital tax regime or to do restructuring or to get a new base value. So this September's tax receipts were the highest of a September since 2008. And that's just the start of what they've unleashed at that point. So all that was going on, but of course all the empty space got filled with freebies and one thing and another and all that discussion and chipping away at the tedious pantomime threadbare language being used, to the point where I think the Prime Minister more or less said that being a working person was a matter of self-identification. You just decide you are. The press got very bored with all of this. It was all they had to go at. And so we come to the budget. And there very clearly was, and it was pointed out during the election campaign, but neither major party was going to allow it, there clearly was going to be a significant issue after the election as to lack of funding for spending out of a stagnant economy. That's the real importance of growth. And Labour has had the right language about growth. The questions were, did they know what those words meant, other than being nice, shiny things to have and show? And did they have a comprehensive theory for it? Planning very definitely fits into that theory, and that's unlocking. It's making business easier. It's what in the jargon gets called a supply-side reform. It's just allowing business to get on with the business of being business and do things. International investment, they're very strong on, so we had the investment summit just before the budget as it happened, which probably was lucky. And then you come to the budget. The language is there, and she said, we know what we have to do to achieve economic growth. It's invest, invest, invest. And the actions aren't. And that actually, in a much larger picture, is the tragedy of this budget. It's the missed opportunity to use the momentum of a massive majority, the manifesto mandate for growth, really to go hard at the very beginning of a parliament to go for it. So if you're a big corporate and you're an international investor, which will go wonderfully into infrastructure, that's good. The work on the planning system, that's good. If you are, though, a humble UK privately owned business, there's nothing in this to make anybody get out of bed. And when we come on to the agricultural bits, a number of reasons why you might wish to stay there. So we've increased public spending by 70 billion. We've increased tax by 40 billion. The Office for Budget Responsibility has given us a pretty damning report, has said, well, all that extra excess spending might give you a bit of growth this year and next, but the only parliament that's going to be worse than this one is the last one, looked at over recent decades. They expect private investment to fall over this parliament, and actually public investment to be lower in 29 than it was last year. It's and the theory they have, and it's a good theory, but it's not a complete one, but it's the theory they have, is that it's investment that will drive growth. That's what we should be wanting to have, as well as making business easier and giving encouragement to enterprise, to a spirit of innovation. That's what we should be doing. Anyway, we have the budget, so we come then to look at the taxes that are raised, because that's really what I was told you wanted to hear about. You were just laying the background. The big hit on business, and these taxes are essentially on business. So we are the most pro-growth, pro-business government that the world will ever have seen, and we're levying taxes on business as the means to get ourselves out of the hole we're in. And they're right, yeah, business needs the public services, it needs health and education, but actually they need business to be strong enough to fund them. And that's the other half of this equation. So, 25 billion of that, less what goes to compensate the public sector, less, of course, how everybody reacts to this, is on employers' national insurance. So this really hits the low-paid part-time staff. And it makes everybody 1.2% more expensive to an employer to have, but they've dropped the bottom, the threshold where it cuts in, from 9,000 to 5,000. That means anybody who earns 9,000 and everybody above automatically costs £615 a year more to employ. Now, farming wages, generally, because of the history of the Agricultural Wages Board, tend to be above that. But you're watching the national minimum wage rise. But when you get into veg processing, when you get into the abattoirs, when you get into the whole food sector, when you get down to catering and hospitality, that's a 15% increase on the cost of somebody earning 9,000. And that's a big shock for sectors that have taken a pounding over the last few years. And that's something where the hospitality sector is coming back very strongly, and the issues around, and again, it spills over into the higher labour sectors of farming, like fruit, veg, pigs, poultry, dairy, and so on. So you have that area. Number of other areas where it's been raised, but obviously the one that's really attracted attention is the one around inheritance tax. She's raised the rate of capital gains tax from 20 to 24%, largely presented as being about shares, but it means that if you have to dispose of property now, you will pay more tax than you did before. But no other change really worth the name to CGT for this kind of conversation. And indeed, no change, and similarly interesting, no change to the basic underlying mechanisms, the principles for assessment for inheritance tax, for agricultural property relief, for business property relief. So what they have done is said, putting APR and BPR together, those two reliefs, one for agricultural land, but nothing else, and the other for business assets, putting them together, say, well, whatever your mix is of those, we will give you £1 million at the current full rate of relief. The full rate of relief we've had since 1992. And thereafter, it'll be 50%, which is pretty much where we were before 1992. And that's a fair point that they make, that this is going back essentially to just before 92, except for two particular positives. One is there's not in this a lower rate for tenanted land, so that's in the full and then the 50. And the second is that bar probably a wrinkle that nobody's explained about 86 Act tenancies, before Carrie comes in. The other is that you've got that first million at full relief, which wasn't there before. The argument they have for this is this protects the small family farm. It's the plutocrat that pays. Which sounds very good on the hustings. You know, this is the great political rhetoric around it all, sounds very good. It's simply, like so many of the words, from working people onwards, it just lacks much contact with reality. So, again, coming back to the role of the CAAV in this, and this is where I was in a call this morning from Mark's office, very kindly. He did absent himself. But this was with DEFRA officials, but I was in on Tuesday afternoon from Dublin, another call with Treasury officials. I'm in next week with Treasury officials. The round of meetings, and my role in that is to say, well, these are the consequences, and this is where the data you're working from is not an accurate representation of the real world. The data they're saying, in the way that officials would express it, the data is precise, I think, and accurate and does what it says. It just doesn't do what ministers says it does. And so we're told 74% of claims, of APR claims, so we've not yet got the stuff for BPR, but 74% of APR claims are below $1 million. So, magic. You're free, Jack. All small farmers are outside because 3/4 of claims are below 1 million. It's only the evil people above who will get caught and pay tax. That, of course, is about APR claims. Those are claims made by people who, when they die, have agricultural property. Agricultural property, those of you doing the course will know it, Mark, but that is agricultural land or pasture, together with ancillary livestock buildings and woodland, together with farmhouses, farm buildings and cottages of a character appropriate to that land. That's what it is. So I have a Georgian rectory, and I have the field, the 30-acre field next to it, which I let somebody have the grazing of. That's an APR claim. I'm a lifestyle hobby farmer. That's an APR claim. Just as much as if it's a small, intense pig farm, because what they have told us is the average size of claims below $1 million is 486,000. Well, that's 50 acres in most parts of the world. I could take you to Armagh, probably, for I know, 1-2 areas in Scotland, certainly into Holbeach, or some of the land around the lake, outside the Lake District, or indeed into bits of Daring, North Wales, where that would be 20 acres. Now, this is at the low end of the spectrum for the units of what we're dealing with, and it's units of ownership, not units of business. This tells you nothing about farms. Simply tells you who died owning what, and in this case, how little. If you take the average cereals farm, DEFRA's latest balance sheet figures for the average cereals farm tells you it's worth 3 million net, 3.1. So if you are going down the roads the government's beginning to tell you about, spread the ownership in the family, you need 4 owners to be within relief. Now, again, doing a block of work on this area where there is no data, broadly, for smaller and medium-sized family farms, probably ownership is broadly divided between the sole trader, the old man, and the old couple, because they made it joint ownership when they took out their first mortgage. And there's never been a good reason to add anybody to it. If they bought some extra land, that may be where the next generation gets put on the books or something. Or an aunt inherited something from a previous generation, and her land is just used by the farm. Now, those things happen. But the core of it is it lies there. Now, the government then said, well, if there are a couple of you, then you've each got $1 million. And that's all very useful, but it's not transferable between them. They each have to find somebody to give it to get advantage of that. And that, of course, depends upon there being family members who are around, liked, and fit to own property. Interested, if they're away working in Geneva or somewhere, or profoundly hostile to business or whatever else it is, or they lack capacity, or in some way, then that rules that one out. You have the tensions between the next generation that are in the farm and those that are outside in all of this. But again, in some families, all that can be reconciled. In other families, this is a matter of problem, and hence the difficulty of looking at this. So playing this through, we have that issue about, well, what does the data tell you? Secondly, the data is not yet about what is the BPR assets. Where are you? Because all this is, what I've talked about so far, is the land. A bit of the farmhouse, the bit that could get tax relief. The buildings. I have not talked about the machinery. I've not talked about the dairy herd and the other livestock. I've not talked about the other assets, the crops in store. I've not talked about the ancillary activity that might also come within a business property relief claim, the holiday cottages which on their own wouldn't count but as part of a business might, the other tourist business that's also in the farm as diversified activity. All those things are not yet sitting there. So if we're looking at these kind of small farms, I've been playing through for models, 300 acres in North Wales, various other sorts of farms, a 1,200 acre cereals farm and so on, which one man might be working. Then at this point, you're playing through and you're getting to some pretty brutal answers, because this is once you get above the million, effectively it's 20% of the value is a cash call on that owner. If you play that through, you can come to rent equivalent figures, outgoings per acre, of between, depending what sort of farm you're dealing with and its scale and the rest, between £200 and £350 an acre, according to value and what's involved. You get to that figure, if you're spreading the tax over the 10 years the Treasury will allow you to spread it. That is an enormous outgoing for that business for 10 years. And so if the government has a goal for growth, if the government has a goal for farming productivity to improve, which we desperately need it to, with the investment, with the sound business structures, with the right people being motivated to do it all, that cash crowds out investment. That is a statutory call on the money in the family every year before they even think about what they can spend on servicing a loan, what they can spend on reinvestment, what they can spend on new machines, whatever it is. And that is a big problem. So we look at another way. You could, of course, raise a loan if you've got the borrowing capacity and spread it over a longer period. Then you just have a longer curse. So the alternative, which of course is what's in most people's minds at the moment, is you look at it by saying, well, I'm just going to have to sell some land, or the house, or whatever. And of course, now the capital gains tax rate has risen. You're then looking at saying, I'm going to have to sell a bit more in order to get the net sum to pay the tax. Now, how that plays through is you started with a business. It's the old joke, how do you get a small business? You start with a large one and keep trading. You end up with a smaller business. You've got the old overheads and less production capacity. And somebody you're wanting to buy that land. And that gets you into question about who will be the buyers for this land. I mean, it could, of course, be other farmers who are optimistic. It could be other ways of dealing with it. It could be environmental bodies. It could be lifestyle people and so on. But if we're looking to have land at its production potential, this is breaking up businesses at this stage to go where? If we follow the strategy of saying we're going to avoid all this by finding the right number of useful family members all to involve and dividing ownerships, and we might do it in different ways. We might say 80 acres here can go to you, and we might then say those involved in the partnership, the active farmers, all have undivided shares as part of the partnership assets. We can look at that, and there's a little valuation advantage in doing that. Then we are complicating the ability of the business to borrow, the ability of the business to manage, because we've got more people to reconcile in all of this. And they may all be very nice now, but they can fall out later. And so we're complicating management and ability to react in a good commercial way as this goes on. So these points, these are the kind of points that I'm making. Obviously, the NFU, the CLA, many farmers and other bodies are nationally and locally making the larger points around all of this, and the particular positions that individuals are finding themselves in. And there is an element of thinking, hold on, this is about taxing the farm. In reality, it's about taxing the taxpayer at that point, and that's quite an important thing to have in mind. It's the unit of ownership, but it doesn't actually, in the end, make it any easier. It just makes linking it back to the farm. One of the difficult situations, most farms are owned, managed by sole traders or by partnerships, and they may well be more people in the partnership than own the farm. A small number, particularly among the larger commercial ones, but not uniquely so, are organised as companies. If you don't have the spare resources to pay the inheritance tax on your share in the company, how are you going to get the money? Answer, the company has to sell something. So the company pays tax on what it sells. It makes you a dividend to give you the money to do it, and you pay income tax on the dividend. It's the double tax trap of having property within, real property within a company. And again, we have to look at and think about all of that as we look through. So there are a host of these issues. There is an enormous amount going on as we look at the kind of issues that are involved in all of this. The first thing, always try and be more level-headed than it might appear is desirable. I mean, it makes a good political campaign to get very excited, but actually we have to look at this in terms of perspective. So I was just quizzed yesterday by somebody who has got a large corporate buyer for a very good farm, foreign, but they're looking at mine, they're long-term. Very broadly, I mean, they need a level of explanation because this is, not only is it hot here, but it's in a background that they don't necessarily fully understand. And the answer is actually none of this may be terribly relevant to them. They can just see right through it for the long term, look at that, it's a company structure, they're used to that, not an issue. For somebody else, and I think it's worth making the point that none of this is intended to happen until April 26. So there's 18 months. We are looking at not, though, having the legislation for this until the Finance Act 25, so next year. We've got a consultation on aspects of this early next year. We have quite a way to go before we see this actually unfolding. There are some people taking urgent and almost certainly premature and possibly ill-judged actions now. And that's likely, more likely than not, to be wrong. We're building a picture of how this plays through. We're trying to assess it. That becomes part of the discussion with the government about, well, actually, how sensible is this? How does this square with any of our other objectives? Are there ways in which this can be revised? And again, we've seen that work through over previous years, but this, of course, is the first big budget, the defining budget of this Parliament for this new government. They may find it harder to change than we've been used to, but we'll see. At some point, reality has to bite. But we're watching this very closely. We're trying to provide good advice. Those of you who are members of the CAAV will be picking up the briefing notes that are on the website. We'll be seeing it in the e-briefing, more in this afternoon's e-briefing. So if you have whatever machine you have on at 3:15, you'll see a bit more there. We're looking at valuation uncertainty as a question in all of this. Valuation of tenancies, because one of the little things that's not been much picked, as far as I know, I'm the only person who's making the point. Because this goes back to the world we were in before 1992. There were questions then that were very live for agricultural assets and for business assets that then paid some tax because they were 50% relieved. That includes, for some people, particularly in Scotland, but also for some joint tenancies in England, that includes the value of an agricultural tenancy that you can't sell. We fought all those court cases in the 80s and early 90s. There is a value. What would you pay to step into the shoes of that person with an unassignable tenancy? That is something that hasn't touched the debate, that actually this becomes, in this sense, a tax on some tenants. out of their estates, on top of whatever other land they own, their livestock, their machinery, and the rest of it all. And again, that's almost certainly an utterly unintended consequence. And that's part of our role, actually, in all these things, is saying these are the perverse and unintended consequences, government. Think about them before you do it. Take advice, discuss. And that's the kind of service that we try to offer in this. So this is a moment for being particularly uncertain about these aspects of the future. There's a very real potential cash call in one way or another on many businesses, and some of it can be answered, for particularly the smaller ones, by restructuring. You shouldn't fall for the view that what you think of, or the world will think of, as a small family farm is immune from this. Some can protect themselves, some will have some cash to pay, but it's all to be thought about. And then we look at the crying need we have to improve the productivity performance of British farming. We are now under more competing uses for rural land than we've ever seen. So we've got the 1.5 million houses. Well, where are they going to get built? We've got these solar farms. No, actually, people get very excited about solar farms, so they're finding the agricultural arguments against them. I can find good housewives in Angus resisting a power line who are now fascinated by the potato cyst nematode. Don't think I've ever heard of it before, but if it's an argument against a pylon, then it's a very good argument in their mind. But we've got the energy side that we need to do. Actually, we're putting less land under solar than we put under concrete for World War II airfields. But that becomes part of that. We're looking at all the material around nature, the 30 by 30 managed for nature. We're looking at issues around carbon. We're looking at issues around woodland. We're looking wherever people want to go on leisure. All these various competing uses. And we are told we're going to get a land use framework by the end of the year. And then a consultation. We are going to have to find ways to be much better. Now, and the top quartile are doing it, and they will get better, but collectively, much better at the efficiency and quality, effectiveness of our food production to be able to meet the needs with all the challenges from climate change, take advantage of all the new technologies as part of all of this. This calls for investment, it calls for skills, it calls for who will use the new technologies well. All these questions are coming at us quickly enough without any of what we've just looked at from the last week. And I think that is where we face the unintended consequences, the unthought through proposals, the challenges of a tragically missed opportunity for a budget to be harsh but lay the foundations for a once again thriving economy, whether national or indeed rural or agricultural. And we're now doing our bit, and it'll happen over the years now as they unfold. We and all of you will be doing our bit to try and help people make the best of this as we go into the future. Now, Mark, I have a suspicion there might be people who've got a question or two, and if they haven't, you probably have. But if that's a sketch of where we are, there's a lot else doubtless to go at. There may be bits in that people want teasing away at or have an additional aspect they want to raise within the time that you have and people's tolerance. And the next time when any of you are teaching, I'm happy to take any questions.
Good. I'm conscious that some people might have a lecture to get to for 2 o'clock. But are there any questions? Jeremy and the team are going to be based in this room for the next couple of hours, meeting various groups of students. So you're more than welcome to stay around or come back or whatever. And if you've got questions that we can't get to now, you can come back to those over those couple of hours. But are there any questions anybody wants to fire out at this particular stage?
I have a question. How are the exemptions for environmental schemes going to work? If you've got, for example, margins around arable fields, is it the whole field that would count, or just the area of the margins?
Right. What we have won, because it's terribly easy to concentrate on with people's concern. It's terribly easy to concentrate on the big proposal in the budget for April 26. What I spent some time on, labouring to explain, and we then had a consultation, and we then, after a year, got an answer from the last government with the March budget, was that APR should actually be expanded so that it could cover land that people entered into environmental agreements with public authorities. And the reason for that was for it to remove a major source of landowner caution about doing anything very particularly environmental on their land, lest they drop out of APR. Now, in practice, a lot of those fears were misplaced because a lot of doing things in the environment involves agricultural practice, but it builds a caution in and holds people back from doing something they might otherwise want to do. So we made the case to government, and as did others, and argued it through, and basically the point was won, later than we'd like, but last March. And then we were in complete limbo over the summer, not knowing whether the new government was remotely interested or not. And as it is, along with furnished holiday lets and taxing them, they picked this tax relief up and have carried it forward because it has no tax consequence. The land was to have been farmland. It either stays as farmland or people choose to put it into this and they give it the relief, it's more likely to be there and it gets the same relief. So the question then is, well, where does the benefit lie on this? And the answer is, effectively, it's where land is seen to move out of agriculture. The object here is to see, and it's got to be in an agreement with a public authority that is for environmental things. So I think really we are looking at something probably longer term in the main than buffers, as you were using. Clearly very applicable probably to a number of things you might find in landscape recovery, capable of applying to core, if I put it this way, actual biodiversity net gain agreements where they take land out of agriculture. A lot of them won't, but some will, and then that can still qualify for APR. But it would be the land itself. If this land is out of agriculture and it's under a qualifying commitment, and of course we wait to see the legislation, but that legislation should be in this finance bill. The finance resolution for it was approved last Wednesday, so it should be in the finance bill published within days. Actually, to give you the hard answer to your question, the soft broad answer to your question is it is land that's taken out of agriculture under an environmental commitment with a public authority, to strip it down to its basics, and that is then able to be there for APR. It then falls. That is then agricultural land, just like a stud farm is, just like short rotation coppice is, and you get your first million on your combined APR and BPR on those terms. So if that the question, if you like, the answers remain the same. You've just got more land or different uses of land you could put into the question. If that serves.
Assuming they do go ahead with the £1 million threshold, how do you see that affecting agricultural land value?
Well, that of course is yes, it's the expensive question that people ask me, and I would always do my best to avoid. What it does is probably change some of the dynamics in the land market. There will be people who will go through the exercises of dividing out ownership and so on, so they lie outside the spectrum. There was a very nice question asked during the budget debate by one MP of the Exchequer Secretary of the Treasury. He said, "Hold on, you're explaining all these ways to avoid your tax. What's the point? What's the point of bringing it in if all you're going to do is say it's not going to needn't affect anybody if they take the action?" And well, there wasn't really an answer, but there's that point. So, at the smaller and depending how you want to define these things, the smaller and lower end of the medium end of the game, people will have an incentive to restructure themselves in that way. There will be some incentive to pass land down the generations earlier through gifts. There will be, but there's a slight trap in that because people will still want income. Now, how am I getting income out of this if I'm giving it away? Is there a risk of that being a gift with reservation of benefit, which again defeats the exercise? And also, being completely grim, there is an interesting argument about having your land rebased for capital gains tax and actually wanting some earlier rebasing on an earlier death for that to come through. So all sorts of dynamics here to think about. Then you have more land coming on. Let's just say you have land coming onto the market to pay the tax. Who are going to be the buyers for that? And there are many reasons, and at different points during the economic cycle, there are many reasons why there are different balances between outside buyers, environmental or amenity buyers, lifestyle buyers, farming buyers. A lot depends on price, but I think probably the floor for the land market may be higher than some people might guess. And it's that shift in the mix of buyers. It's too easy to assume that it just drops. What we see in the early stages is more likely that the land market pauses, that land, as we see in some parts of the country at the moment, land just simply doesn't sell until people are removed where it does. A lot will depend on location. Deep farming areas may react differently to areas in the home counties. So all I can do is try and talk through what some of the dynamics might be. Remember, this hits individuals. This does not hit any owner or buyer who is not an individual. Doesn't directly hit companies, doesn't hit charities, doesn't hit the corporations, the institutions, and so on. And they then have a correspondingly stronger position in the market. We wait to see is the real answer to your question.
Well, the hand over here, early on.
Been answered.
You don't have
All right.
Martin?
I'm not sure if it's a question or a request. It just gets for the benefit of everyone else in the room. The issues about being qualified to give financial advice going forward, and your thoughts on professional indemnity premiums, insurance premiums going forward.
Yeah, I mean,
That's the reason for mentioning financial qualifications, to make sure everybody in the room understands.
Yeah, I mean, this is where we're on the edge of what is property and what is finance, is probably part of that. And one of the things that we do in the insurance market is we explain to the insurance market the particular benefits of the CAAV qualification, the fellowship of the association. It's specialised. We're in an area where, on the whole, many of the financial issues, this is all about risk management and reducing risk. And we have underwriters who are willing to recognise the role of fellows in this with the support and sort of professional community and the rest that goes around that. And this means that fellows, if they're doing core agricultural work, less so if they're valuing asbestos factories, but if they're doing core agricultural work, then this serves to give them more attractive or less unattractive premiums than they would otherwise have. So, but we've gone through mills like this before. Back in 2003, we were suddenly told by the European Commission that your access to rights to future area payments turned on what land you occupied. And we had to keep a land transactions market going. And we sat down, I remember it was in Withers' offices in London, and we sat down for a whole morning hammering out the ways by which you could keep the land market moving while preserving people's future prospects. We went through something of this through the pandemic. We went through something of this when interest rates came back to normal a couple of years ago. This is by no means a unique shock, and it's certainly not as comprehensive as some of the ones we faced. So I understand the points you're making. There's a risk that we overmake the concern.
Joe, if you do need to go to a lecture, then by all means, just go quietly. Don't make a noise. But we'll carry on. Joe.
These changes to APR, is it something you see coming through an ideological change, or is it just a need for cash? And because of all the climate change?
Yeah, this is difficult to call. There's been a view around among the if you like, the academic tax advisors that BPR and APR are slightly illegitimate reliefs. They overprotect and over-reward, and a sense that this is an area where, and this is where it now merges with the politics, they said they should be focused on where they're meant to be rather than allowed to spread out as they were saying they have. And so you have this with BPR, and I think it's easy. We're focusing on the farming end of this. All this applies to any other business. So the people in the press, you run a pub, you own the pub. You have a shoal of people, you're running a very good pub, it's got goodwill. You're going to wind up paying inheritance tax on that. You are, somebody in the press at the weekend who is running a substantial undertaker's business. That's been in the family for years. I'm thinking of a cider factory I was talking about over lunch. In family ownership, family built over 5 generations. They're going to wind up paying very significant inheritance tax out of that. So, in a sense, we're very conscious of where we are. There is a bigger picture. It's just, on the whole, farming's much better organised to argue about it. I know I have heard the view, this is revenge for the miners, or it's kicking traditional Tory voters, or whatever. I have to start, I think, with an approach of charity at this point. I think this spills over from a desire to focus on reliefs. I think they've misunderstood the position about small family farms completely. Darling buds of May still lives in their minds. They are in a serious tax hole. The real original sin here is denying themselves, making that pledge not to raise income tax, VAT, corporation tax, national insurance. Those are 2/3, 3/4 of the entire tax base. So they're left stuck finding 40 billion from about 1/4 of the tax base. That's a hell of an exam question to set somebody. So I don't, shall we say, ideology may colour. I don't think ideology drives.
And are you finding that the response to your consultation is, we didn't realise this, and we therefore maybe make
I am in very open and, from their side, receptive discussions with the civil servants. We're exploring information and data. The conversations overrun the length for the meetings. It's all been conducted very civilly. I don't think it's right to say anything more than that. No, or indeed useful to say anything more than that. No, there is use. Shall we say, all this is useful in informing them. And at the end of the day, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. We shall find out later on. But I'm not being given a closed door.
And are they truly shocked about the information that you're telling them, or do you think they actually knew about it?
I think probably some of the civil servants understood the limitations of the data. I think quite clearly ministers didn't. And indeed, this is where ministers have dug themselves another hole by referring, obviously, to the ability of spouses to be able to have a double million out of that. And that's been misunderstood in the marketplace and probably in the minister's mind in explaining it, because that's then created other senses that aren't entirely accurate for how this flows. There are very clear difficulties of language in all of this, and it's reconciling language with meaning is a substantive issue. Now, I think what I should say is there is no closed door on these discussions. Points are being made, points are being heard. They're obviously weighing it against everything else they've got to weigh it against. And this is, here we are a week after the budget. This is early days.
Any other questions? There's one online. Oh, that's complicated. Two places to look. Okay, so since a good proportion of land is purchased by institutions / large investors who are not necessarily affected in the same way by the change in IHT, do you expect to see a significant change in land values due to a reduction in demand?
I think it shifts demand is probably the easiest answer to the question. It doesn't necessarily reduce it. It may attract new players in now that I think the point, and I was trying to make it earlier, is that this arguably reduces the financial ability of individuals in farming to be able to bid for land or invest in their businesses or expand their businesses relative to other players like your institutions. So arguably, you wind up with institutional farming being among the various outcomes that could stem from this, which again isn't quite what the presentation was for.
My client transferred their farm, set value £2.5 million in 2022, to a trust. If my client passes within 7 years, will the legislation be applicable? If the client, and there's a lot of discussion, quite entertaining discussion about the right time to die. There were a number of people who were complimented for managing to die before October 30th. In this case, the rules are over gifts, because if you gift, you've got 3 years after the gift in which you are fully exposed to tax, and then the following 4 years it erodes away. It's a potentially exempt transfer, a pet. It erodes away to nothing after the 7th year. And the way the government set out the rules here in its briefing is if they die before April 26,
So you've got 18 months. Then you're assessed under the current rules. If you die after April 26, you'd be assessed on the gift under the new rules. The little point here that tends to get forgotten in this is that there was a case called Nelson Dance. Nelson Dance was a Hampshire landowner. Nelson Dance gave about 400 acres and a couple of cottages to, I think, a daughter. 15 months later, Nelson Dance died. The revenue were absolutely adamant that there was tax to pay because it was within the 3 years, and indeed the 7. Went to the Court of Appeal. And the Court of Appeal said, no, look, this is a transfer. There was a transfer of value. The transfer of value was relieved under APR. It was qualifying for APR. It was still in agricultural use at the time of death. Therefore, there was no tax to pay. So your donor is relying on his trustees now to keep it in agricultural use, provided you look at the other tests and the facts of the case and the rest of it, which we don't know and we're not going to find out, then he may be in a happier position than he is currently fearing. But the other trap, of course, is he can now only fund one more trust since the budget under the new rules, as we're told there will be. And sometimes the trust isn't always where you want it to be. So I had a question the other day. A farmer has managed to gift all the land around the farmhouse to his self-invested pension plan, his SIP. And he's now finding that a bit awkward in the face of all of this. And he may have to unscramble his trust to deal with it. Again, all human life is out there. It'll make it fascinating.
Please can an explanation be provided?
Of?
Please can an explanation be provided on the nil rate band and residential nil rate band?
Yes.
And its inclusion
Yes.
in the suggestion
Yes.
that up to £3 million
Yep.
of
Right.
relief could be obtained
Yep.
from the death of a husband and wife
Yep.
jointly owned farm,
Yes.
which value exceeds £1 million.
Yep. Right. Okay. So we start, and this is quite right. In order to focus on the issue, because this can rapidly get very confused, I left the nil rate bands out. But when you're looking at any taxpayer for inheritance tax, nil rate bands matter. So if we build this one up, we start with every taxpayer having a £325,000 nil rate band. Now that covers all assets. So, family effects, furniture, the car, whatever else, everything else around you. With this budget from 27, it'll include your unused pension fund. Goes into it. All sorts. So don't just think about this as being agricultural property. There's everything else you own. So you start with the 325. That was fixed in 2009. It's now to be frozen at that 2009 level through to 2030 for 21 years. So that you can transfer between husband and wife. So what you don't use, the other spouse can use, and so on, along with spouse relief, gifts between spouses. Then the first gift doesn't cause an issue. You've just got to marry the grandson's fiancée in order to be able to get through this one. You then have what was invented in the middle of the last decade, which is the residential nil rate band amount. And this was slightly to get out of the hole that rising house values were getting more and more people into inheritance tax. And there's a sort of political sense that 6% of estates is tolerable and 12% isn't. The political pressures just get too great. And so they invented this. Basically, it's to allow a house you've lived in to be given to a descendant. So the classic is you've been living in the house, you've been caring for the old person, they die, you want to carry on living there. Why should you pay inheritance tax on that? All the moral arguments that flow around that. And this was an answer to it. There's 175,000, and that's for each. Quite useful in the context of a farmhouse. So you're sitting there on a wonderfully traditional 16th century farmhouse in rural Shropshire. It's in the million. So you've got £700,000 as a general figure that will be covered by APR, but 300,000 of extra market value that won't be. This can plug that gap. So that's quite useful there. It's a bit complicated, but you can do that. But again, this is all that's on top of, that's specifically for a house. If you don't have the house, or you don't have a lineal descendant, it's no use to you or anybody. So it does depend on particular facts. It's then when we come to look at what you've got left after however you've used those, we then start saying, how much agricultural property have you got? How much business property have you got? You've got $1 million available fully on that, and then it's 50% thereafter. That probably then gets us into an interesting little question, in that for a quirk of tax law, APR, so the relief on land and buildings, is taken first. So that goes through. So it's far more likely that we're going to be arguing more about the value of business assets than we are about land when we come to look at this. I have threatened the tax tribunal, or at least somebody who might have to advise the tax tribunal, that they could find they've got a BPR issue of the value of 4,000 tonnes of clamped silage. Yeah, the advisor thought this could be very entertaining. But the valuation of a dairy herd, the valuation of company shares, the valuation of the agricultural tenancy, all these things we've not had really as inheritance tax questions since 1992, are all of a sudden back here to create professional work for everybody. So that's the sort of sequence. So in absolute theory, play it through, we've got a farm, let's just say we've got, it's that average cereals farm of 3.1 million. Well, let's just say the 325 actually gets absorbed on other things. The remains of a pension fund, family heirlooms and jewellery and the rest, and the car, probably the thoroughbred in the paddock. And then you come, and then we can gift the house down, and we've got that sorted. And then they arrange it between the couple that they each give $1 million so that it goes down to the two others in the next generation who are in the family partnership. So at this point, they're out clean. They're out clean. They've gifted it down. That works if all the facts for doing that are in place. And it's this problem. They're trying to sell a package answer for people who don't live in packages.
Just on that, Jeremy, because we've got taper relief on that residential nil rate band.
Yes.
Once we've got an estate that's
Yes.
valued over
Yes.
3 million. So the 3 million question.
Told you this would get complicated.
So the 3 million
Yes.
question we've got here, actually, is it 3 million? Because we're already over that 2 million.
Right.
target.
So this is the extra quirk. For those of you who weren't listening to this immediate exchange here, the residential nil rate band amount, the 175,000 transferable between spouses, that is subject to ceilings. You can claim it fully, the full 350 between a couple, you can claim on if your estate is less than 2 million. If your estate is above 2.7 million, you've lost it. You don't have it. And in between, it's tapered down. So, of course, this then is where you get to the art of trying to give, if there's enough liquidity in all of this, and that's a really big if around all these manoeuvres, we can be terribly clever until we actually have to live on what's left. But in principle, if you gift down to give assets to the next generation while still having enough to live on, then pulling your own estate below 2 million unlocks the full residential nil rate band amount, that 175,000 a person, 350,000 a couple. So it's another piece of this multi-dimensional jigsaw that this proposal would, as it stands, set up. None of this is quite as simple as dear sweet ministers appeared to have inhaled.
Jeremy, the APR and the BPR relief got combined.
For this purpose, yes.
For this purpose. Do you think the Treasury meant to combine them, or was that word that just got slipped into the budget speech that said
This is what, yeah, was it intentional to combine them? Well, I mean, one answer, of course, doubtless yes. but I mean, it says, who knows? What there has been is a block of chatter around the think tanks, which was saying, well, why don't you just cap these wretched reliefs? No, think tanks being dismissive about all of this. And they were saying cap at 500,000. Now, that looked pretty horrific. What decent business, what small farm, what professional practice is really in there worth its salt with the continuity and goodwill is sitting there at that level? Because all this is a tax on professional practices as much as pubs and farms and the rest. So I think they put the two together. They probably thought that was a flexibility and a generosity. It's an interestingly novel approach. So I think it throws up that sequencing question that throws the weight of valuation contest onto business assets. But no, shall we say, I think the whole thing falls into the category of proposals that haven't been thought through. There's always a suspicion that people come up with ideas that good ministers have for years rejected, and every so often a stupid minister falls for one. And then all hell breaks loose. It may yet be we're in that territory.